Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jane Clark, and I would like to share with you the effects of substance exposure on development and talk a little bit about early childhood mental health and intervention. I have my email address up at the top of this slide, and I will include it at the end slide as well. If anybody has any questions or comments, I would love to hear from you. So what I would like to go over with you today is first to discuss what babies need. We can't understand how to support a baby who might have had prenatal drug exposure or exposed to stress and trauma if we don't understand what normal development is. Then I would like to discuss what is important to know on how we support these babies, and then how to heal dyads. And what I mean by dyad is the relationship between the caregiver and the infant or young child. So first off, I wanted to describe and define the term infant mental health, which is defined by 0 to 3, which is the premier institute national institute that really focuses on this age group. And they define infant mental health as the young child's capacity to experience, regulate, and express emotions, form close and secure relationships, and explore the environment. And this is going to be important as we move forward. In order to be able to regulate emotions and be able to explore the environment and develop relationships, babies need dyadic face-to-face interactions. And again, dyadic means the relationship between the caregiver and the infant. So the two, like this picture here of Dr. Brazelton, who was a very famous pediatrician in our country, being face-to-face builds a foundation for regulation, language competence, attachment, and expands a child's sense of self, which is very important for young children. Also, infants and young children are very sensitive when this is not available to them. So we will look at what happens when that isn't. But why do we focus on the prenatal to 3 age period? Why does 0 to 3, and why do we always stress that this is such an important period? Because this is the most sensitive for a child's developing brain and body, and yet many families that we know may face substantial challenges during these years. And so it's important for all of us to understand the importance of these earliest years and how to support the dyad, the caregiver and infant or caregiver and young child, as well as the family. To be developmentally informed, meaning understanding about what is needed for a child's development, we need to look at their ability to achieve optimal social emotional, cognitive, which means their thinking skills, their language, how they communicate, and their physical development. And all of this is dependent upon their play, how they explore the environment, their interaction with others, and especially their ability to fall in love or be in love with a safe and nurturing adult. In order for them to be able to do all of these things, the play, the exploration, learning how to be with other people, they need to feel secure that somebody there will be there to protect them and is going to be there if they need them. So when we talk about having that kind of adult who is sensitive to the child's needs, their interests, their intentions, we talk about attachment, and some of you may have heard this term. Very important term that also relates to a caregiver's ability to calm a child. So if they've become distressed, or if they've fallen down and scraped their knee, how does the caregiver support that young child in order to help them regulate and to be able to get over this stressful situation? So attachment is a reciprocal process, which means that it's bidirectional. It goes from the caregiver to the infant or child, and it's an emotional connection, a connection that makes the child and the caregiver feel so familiar with each other that they understand each other completely. And so it develops between an infant and a caregiver from the time of birth. It doesn't fully manifest until the child is between 6 to 9 months, just because those beginning months are a time to get to know each other. And so attachment influences the child's all those developmental skills that I'd mentioned before, their physical, cognitive, language, and psychological development, how they feel about themselves, and whether they trust people. So attachment shapes how the child will relate to the world around him or her, and how she will learn in school and form relationships throughout life. But what does it look like? It looks like a parental sensitivity to a child's signals. And what I mean by signals is that the child may make a face and that the parent can read that facial expression and maybe the vocalization that goes along with it, and knows whether the child is getting tired and now needs to go for a nap, or the child is getting hungry, or the child wants more attention and is tired of playing with a certain activity. And it includes nonverbal and verbal, what we call contingent communication. Meaning, if we imagine the kind of conversations that we have with family members or with loved ones, when we say something, we expect the partner, our friend or loved one, to respond back. And there's a timing to it. And that's what is meant by the contingency. The baby makes a sound, ah, and mom goes, ah, you see the doggy coming in, don't you? You see the doggy. And so the caregiver responds to the child's vocalization. The child responds then back to the caregiver to show them that they knew exactly what they were trying to communicate. And so they have this back and forth. And this is one of the things that is the most important for brain development. And then there's aligned mental states so that the child feels felt. And that's the same thing. Again, if the child makes a face like they're beginning to fuss and get distressed, a caregiver is able to see that before they get really upset and is able to say something. Oh, you're uncomfortable in that seat, for example. And the child feels that. That's the felt sense of somebody gets me. Somebody understands me. And that's what we mean about aligning mental states. And then finally, attachment means helping a young child regulate in the moment. because before a child gets into full-blown crying, the parent can begin to see when they're beginning to escalate, they're beginning to fuss, and the parent can soothe them with their voice, with a calm voice, or can soothe them enough and pick them up so that then the child is able to regulate their body and their state. So the reason that we think about all these things and why it's so important, again, this age group, is because the brain is going through the greatest developmental activity during this time period. And the brain organizes itself from the bottom up. And so when we think of looking down at the bottom on this left side, the brainstem, those are actually things that develop while the baby is in utero. And what we know, and we're going to look at about those areas of the brain and the functions that are impacted by prenatal drug or alcohol exposure, it really has to do with the timing of that exposure and which area of the brain is most vulnerable to the effects. So what we might see is down here at the bottom, at the level of the brainstem, that would be an area that is impacted, that may be more sensitive for a child having exposure during a time when that part of the brain is really organizing itself. So when we think about, and we're going to go in and talk about the prenatal drug exposure, but one of the things that's really important to me over the years that I have worked with many families and many babies is that we don't know what we don't know. And very often parents or caregivers are less likely to provide the kind of stimulating and responsive caregiving if they don't realize that their interactions are so important for a child's development. And if a caregiver or parent doesn't realize that their interactions impact how a child learns language, how they begin to cognitively learn about thinking about their environment, they're less likely to provide that appropriate stimulation and responsive caregiving. So caregiver knowledge about child development and their beliefs about infants and young children and their expected milestones affects how they interact with them. And this is why a lot of us are here to share and join with caregivers to help them understand how to best support the development of their own child. But what we know is that there are differing timetables, that the clock of child development means right from the get-go in utero, and especially at the newborn stage, all children need stable and secure caregivers immediately. And what we know about the clock of addiction is that most people who do not achieve long-term sobriety right away. There are periods of cycling relapse, and that's just part of what we consider the disease and all that goes into that self-medication and that addiction. So we keep that in mind because when we think about recovery and we think about parenting, we need to support both so that a caregiver or parent feels confident that they can do this, that they are the most important person for that child, and that they can have that confidence to be able to care and support that child. So in just briefly, in our history in infant mental health, the term was first coined in the 1970s by Selma Freiberg and her colleagues who worked with families by observing parent-child interactions, and their focus was on strengthening relationships between parents and children in vulnerable families. We can always, and what we've learned from her and going forward, we can always support the connection. We can always support that relationship. And she wrote a very important paper called Ghosts in the Nursery, where she explored the intergenerational transmission, meaning that our grandmother, our mother, our grandmother, our great-grandmother, we can transmit attachment disturbances and the influence of past family trauma on current parenting behaviors. All of us have this. When our children are first born, we begin to unconsciously parent the way we were parented. So looking at, thinking about those ghosts in the nursery, if we've got anxiety, we've got unresolved trauma, we are also using drugs or alcohol to self-medicate, what we've found about young babies and the prenatal exposure is that substances act as a stressor that disrupts what we call the fetal programming of a baby. And the way that it disrupts this genetic programming is that it makes the stress response, which is called an area of the brain called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, this stress response has a higher set point, meaning that the child is expecting that life is going to be stressful outside of the womb and is already preparing for that. And what that means is that that baby may be more sensitive, may fuss more, may cry more when they're born. And this dysregulation that is caused by this kind of stress that we can relate to, because it relates to the stress in our body. It doesn't feel comfortable. And for newborns to have that kind of dysregulation, if that child is not provided the kind of support that they need, can lead to behavioral, emotional, and neurocognitive deficits related to the prenatal drug exposure. So very often what we will see is medical issues in the newborn with prenatal drug and alcohol exposure. And these are risks to this attachment, this important relationship I talked to you about, and development. There's a higher predisposition towards prematurity, low birth weight, neurobehavioral abnormalities, breastfeeding challenges that can make a parent feel as if they're not, that it's their fault. And the low birth weight and the prematurity already can predispose a child to certain kinds of developmental challenges. So we want to, right from the get-go, be able to support that dyad with a baby with prematurity, low birth weight, or these breastfeeding challenges, or withdrawal symptoms. We know that those are risk factors that place a child at risk for developmental delay. But we know that if we intervene early and support the caregiver and child in their relationship and in their interactions, we can help that child to develop to the best of their ability. So what we see very often at birth, a baby's cues if they've been born premature or they've had withdrawal symptoms. They're cues, meaning those signals, those facial expressions, those body movements, the vocalizations that a child might make are difficult to interpret. And this may be because of all of those different aspects that I talked about before. And there may be, as a parent or caregiver, there may be inaccurate interpretation of these cues by the parents because they don't know what they mean, and it may make the parent feel less confident. It may even make a parent feel as if the baby doesn't love me, and it can really interfere with bonding. And then very often we can have issues that are at the hospital that can also add to difficulties there. So different neurobehaviors that we think of that are risks to attachment and development are ones that are very common that we see, that they're much more prone to stress because, as I said, in utero, if they experience stress, if the caregiver had experienced stress, then that means that they're much more easily set into having this physiological reaction to something that might be stressful. There might be poor quality of movement, or they may be stiffer in their body, which may again be hard for the caregiver to understand that the baby is not just molding into the mother's body, or that the baby is purposefully or intentionally trying not to mold into the body. So we want to support all that because we can help a baby get to a place where they can be more relaxed in their body and they can be less stressed by the environment. But very often what happens is that for the caregiver or parent, there's a lack of this early life attachment relationship, that loving relationship where you always know that somebody has your back and that they're going to protect you and help you develop. And without that, we can have the underdevelopment of what's called the reward system, so that parenting then doesn't feel quite as rewarding as it might, or what you might have expected. And so that these reward systems using dopamine stimulating or opioid like drugs become an alternative route to finding that reward, rather than feeling that reward from just being a parent and being in relationship with the baby. So other challenges can be that the mother or caregiver had a lack of parenting role models early on. Again, these may add to the ghosts in the nursery. There's not low parental confidence. There may be exposure to violence or a chaotic environment, which causes stress and reduces what we call the parents' resources. Their energy level is actually just zapped by the stress of violence or poverty or other kinds of relational disturbances that interfere with their ability to feel rewarded by parenting and to be able to read a baby's cues and help with their regulation. If there's depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, all of these interfere with that feeling of reward and that feeling of developing a secure attachment relationship. And then the child may be challenging by the prematurity or those other different conditions that I mentioned. So one of the things that we know that is so important to help a caregiver and parent develop is what we call reflective function. And what that means is that this is the ability to understand someone's behavior in terms of their thoughts, feelings, and intentions. So one, we have to be able to have reflective function of our own abilities, our own intentions, feelings, thoughts, and then we need to be able to understand our baby's thoughts, feelings, and intentions, or the infant or the young child. The more familiar that a caregiver and baby become with each other, the more that they become so familiar, they can begin to read what a child is feeling just by the look on their face, and understand what they might be interested in by how they might be pointing over in a certain direction or looking in that direction. And they may be able to understand their intention before they get to it. He looks like he's going for that cell phone. I'm going to move it before he gets to it. They've found that this is a missing link in the intergenerational transmission of parents' experiences, meaning that very often if there's been a lot of trauma and a lot of stress and again substance exposure or substance use, it interferes with this ability to understand the other. And in this case, we're talking about the baby. So when we think about having this reflective function, we need what's called the cortical part of our brain, which is this turquoise up at the top. And the brain, as I mentioned, develops from the bottom up, from the brainstem to the midbrain to the limbic to the cortical, and then it integrates all together. But the cortical part is what we call the upstairs brain. And it's responsible for being able to reflect about what our own thoughts are, as well as reflecting on what our child's thoughts are. It's also responsible for planning. Planning, what am I going to have for dinner? Do I have enough for the baby for dinner? It has to do with empathy and decision making. And the downstairs brain has more basic survival functions, such as breathing and arousal, and this fight, flight, or freeze response, and strong emotions like anger and fear. And when we go into strong emotions like fear or anger, it can close off our ability to have access to this upstairs brain, to be able to reflect. And we know that the brain works best when it is integrated. Integration is about being open. But when we get stressed, our upstairs brain goes offline. It's very difficult to plan. It's difficult to think ahead. It's difficult to imagine. And it's difficult to regulate. A dysregulated adult cannot regulate a dysregulated child. And so we want to hold on to the neurobiology, because adverse life experiences and circumstances, such as poverty would be a risk factor, that it would be an adverse life circumstance, or traumatic stressors or mental health problems. They affect emotional regulation in the caregiver or adult, and they interfere with adaptive parenting. Adaptive means that you're able to be flexible and change when the child needs you to change. These factors have a direct impact on the child's moment-to-moment experiences, and they may distort the parent's ability to notice, to interpret, and respond to the child's needs or interests. And this is not out of malintention because the parent wants to ignore the child. It's because their brain and maybe their upstairs brain has gone offline. So when parents can't mentalize about their baby, the child might take on the parent's affect. So, for example, a mother was telling me that her child pulled all the court papers that she had off the table and threw them on the floor. And she became so enraged. She was able to describe it, that she became so mad. And then the child began to get mad himself, not knowing why he was mad because he was only 2 years old, but he began to get upset as well. And she had a history of domestic violence, of relationship problems with her partner, and so she began to think he's just like his father. He just wants to hit me. And so it just distorted their relationship. The child didn't know those were court papers. Maybe they should have been pushed further back on the table. But this is how those moment-to-moment experiences can happen, and where a parent is not able to repair something that has happened between them. So ghosts in the nursery, unresolved trauma, things that the parent is working through, all interfere with their ability to mentalize their baby. So this is the still face that I just wanted to show you quickly, to show you how babies are responsive to face-to-face interactions, this back and forth, this attunement to their emotions, and to show you what happens when that's not available.
How do children learn? New scientific findings suggest that the process isn't what many think it is. You see, most people believe that intellectual learning, reading, counting, and the like, is separate from emotional and social learning.
Yay!
But that's just not the case. Emotion is critical to learning.
Trey.
Babies process sensations from the moment of birth,
Hi.
and even in the womb.
Hi, baby.
They sense that a light is bright, or that a parent's touch is soft. They immediately attach values to those sensations, emotional reactions. A loud noise hurts, a caregiver's bedtime lullaby, soothing.
Oh, my goodness.
It's through these emotional connections that a baby's brain begins to learn about and organize the world. Even more, researchers have found that it's connection to the people in a baby's world that makes the most difference.
I can't see my baby, Gabrielle. Peekaboo, I can see you.
Children are wired to learn through their important caregivers,
Watch this. Watch.
and we as adults are wired to teach them.
You do it.
Dr. Edward Tronick of Harvard and Children's Hospital's Child Development Unit has devised a way to show how important this social connection is to babies and how much it affects them when the connection with a parent or caregiver is broken. First, Dr. Tronick places 6-month-old Mackenzie and her mother face to face.
Hi. Can I touch her?
He asks Mom to talk and play with her daughter the way she normally does.
Hi, sweetheart.
Obviously, their connection is strong.
Yes, there's my baby.
The baby is engaged, responsive, clearly emotionally content. Then, Dr. Tronick instructs the mother to disengage by making a still face. She stays there, but doesn't respond to her baby. Mackenzie is confused at first. She's not used to Mom acting like that. Mom turns back, but keeps the still face. Mackenzie expects her to re-engage, but when she doesn't, look how the baby reacts. Even at this young age, she tries to entice Mom to interact with her. She reaches out. She smiles. She flails her hands. All strategies for getting Mom's attention. When that doesn't work, she becomes fussy, emotionally agitated. And finally, she just gives up.
The meaning of the event is this emotion that the infant is experiencing in relationship to this breaking of the connection in relationship to the mother. And that's a fearful, frightening thing. And the infant will do a lot to try and overcome it. But when they fail with a sense of helplessness and a loss of control.
Dr. Tronick then asks Mom to re-engage.
What a good girl.
It takes a moment, but soon the world goes back to normal for Mackenzie.
Round, round, and
This strikes
So I wanted to just show you that in the sense that when babies have experienced neglect, it looks very similar to the still face. But the difference is that with the still face experiment, the caregiver repaired it by coming back and interacting with the child. When there's no repair and there's no response to a child's cues or their language or their bids for connection, then it becomes very similar to the still face and affects their social emotional well-being. So when we think about how do we interrupt this, how do we interrupt generationally transmitted patterns of ACEs, prenatal drug exposure, attachment problems, developmental vulnerabilities, the way that we do it is to understand the relationship more and to expand those relational connections, to support the caregiver to begin to notice and interpret and respond to the child in a way that makes the child feel felt, and to help them both make meaning together, to understand each other and to make sense of their experiences together and the world. So what is good enough parenting? When we think about a child who is prenatally drug exposed, one of the things that we know that I have learned from my teachers is that they don't need anything different, but they need more of it because of their sensitivity, because of maybe prematurity, low birth weight, withdrawal symptoms that they had had early on. So good enough parenting includes having this primary preoccupation, meaning that this is the priority for the parent, is the child and the child's well-being. Having a mentalizing stance means reflective function, being able to begin to understand what the child is thinking and their needs and interests and intentions. Mirroring, beginning to imitate them when they vocalize, to imitate their actions, attuning to their motions and attuning to their language. Having this joint attention and shared affect, meaning that when you're playing, that you both have this shared attention and can get each other to respond back and forth in what we call serve and return. How you help the baby learn, how you repair things when there's been times when you haven't been available, emotionally available, or if the child has experienced stress, how we help with that regulation. and how to be predictable and emotionally safe. These are all things that can be learned and practiced and are part of this upstairs brain that we want to access. So windows of opportunity, prenatal through the first years of life, are qualitatively and quantitatively very different from any other time of life. They require an attentive parent or caregiver. And most parents who become addicted to substances or alcohol express a strong desire to become better parents. I don't know any parent who intended to not be the best parent that they could be. So every encounter we have as professionals with a caregiver, an infant or young child, is an opportunity to support the relationship, to support that connection that the caregiver and child have together, and facilitate development. So this is how we overcome ACEs, is through these connections, learning new ways of being together. And one of the things that we know from epigenetics is a big term about how we get our genes that we're born with from our parents and our grandparents, how we get to turn them on or off so that we can not only develop better parenting skills, but we can help support our child to develop in the best capacity that they are able, is that our genes are influenced by our actions, what we do, by our perceptions, how we feel about things, what our beliefs are, and our attitudes. The more access to the upstairs brain, the more you can feel in control, the more that you can begin to engage in reflective functions. So the good news is that we can actually change the brain to the better, and that even if there's been adverse events that have happened, we can, through moment-to-moment parenting interactions, support a change in that dyad. What we know about working with women or men who have substance use disorders is that positive versus punitive interactions create change. So we really want to support that attachment relationship through affect, sharing, and promote the child's development, help a parent deal with unresolved trauma or adversity so they're able to be in the present. When we're stressed, it's very hard to be in the moment with the child. The child is in the moment. A baby is in the moment. They are not thinking down the road to the future or thinking of the past. Provide substance use treatment that includes both recovery and parenting. Help parents' ability to notice, interpret, and respond to a child's needs, intentions, or interests. And we deepen these serve and return interactions. And strengthen core parenting and life skills. So in ending this, I wanted to give you a few take-home points that the effects of substance use, stress, and ACEs impact similar areas of the brain and can compound each other. Very often what they do is make that downstairs brain more dominant, and it's more takes over. And so those big overwhelming emotions and those feelings of fight or flight or freezing take over. So it changes the chemicals, structure, and thinking and can make parenting a challenge. But we know that these challenges mean that interventions that help with connections and help to find solutions and services that will be most helpful to support that relationship and those connections are what makes a difference. We all can work to build and expand relational connections, trust, pleasure, and confidence in a dyad. And that is not by telling the caregiver or parent what to do. It's about helping them find their own path, helping them begin to notice on their own, and have the process be one of joining together rather than telling them what to do. And finally, services to support the caregiver-child relationship are extremely important for families in recovery. And infant and early childhood mental health treatment addresses parent-child relationship disturbances, trauma or adverse early childhood experiences, and prevents or reduces the impact of social and emotional problems in young children. Early intervention services, on the other hand, help infants and toddlers with delays or disabilities to learn many key skills and catch up in their development through supporting the family and relationships. So early developmental intervention and infant early childhood mental health treatment are conceptualized as two equal parts that together create a sum greater than the individual components. They're very important, they're available, they're free, they are available from the minute that a parent realizes that they are pregnant all the way to 3 to 5 years of age. So a clear understanding of these types of services assures the best collaborative plan of care for infants and children with prenatal substance exposure and their families. Thank you so much for listening to me. Here is my email address again, and please contact me if you have you want more information or have any comment. Thank you.